I think that America right now is in a pressure cooker, not just my family living in a cabin in Tennessee for a month, but I think a lot of families are in this pressure cooker situation as you try and homeschool children, or at least go a hybrid method, have aging adult relatives who you have missed for months and perhaps are now suddenly living with you, or just trying to conduct everyday business like going to the grocery store in a pandemic. It's certainly an interesting time for Americans right now. And as we're in this time, I would say that, we saw a lot of transactions that had paused in the spring as people really pulled back in spending and pulled back in their everyday activity, and they're back. And we absolutely have seen that in the summer. We saw that now after Labor Day, well into the fall, when traditionally families would just kind of settle in and be in the home that they're in for a little bit and probably not have that move, especially if they have school age children. But right now, we're really seeing that people are embracing moving at different times of years than they would traditionally and to different places. So I'm going to go over some of the data that we have. We have some Massachusetts data I'm going to show you as well. But in all honesty, you guys know your market way better than I do. So a lot of the data I'm going to be going through, the vast majority of it is going to be national statistics, national trends. I think that you'll probably relate to some of these, perhaps even on a personal level as I go through them, but let me jump right in. And I think we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end too. So I am happy to take questions. But if you guys are like, oh my God, she is crazy, feel free to put that in the chat box too. We could save the questions for the end, but we can go over that as well. All right, so jumping in, what we're seeing on a national level is that, yes, you've probably heard a lot of fodder about this V-shaped recovery. As far as housing goes, yes, absolutely. Home buyers are back in the market. They did take that pause. They're absolutely back there. And we are seeing actually the highest growth in home sales, the highest level of home sales since 2006. That is truly impressive. It actually has surpassed last year's home sales statistics. So we really are quite impressed with the data that we're seeing right now. A lot of that has to do with interest rates, but a lot of it has to do with families really reevaluating where they're living and saying, I need to find a new place to make this work for me. So maybe that's a bigger home, less density, and we'll go through some of that data as well. The other big thing that we're seeing is that homes are moving at a record pace. They actually 21 days from the typical list to contract time. And you guys will probably laugh at me because I think in many areas, especially if it's an affordably priced home, you probably see that move much quicker, probably within a day or two, as opposed to 21 days. But this is just looking at a national scale. We also have the longest period of time, and I have been saying this now for a couple of years, but we truly do have the longest period of time of year over year home price growth, 103 months. We've collected this data back to the 1960s. We have never seen this amount of home price growth. Now, some of this has to do with how we collect the data. So when we look at this, what we're analyzing is what homes sold in the last month. Now, if we look at the homes in the last month, what we saw is that homes that are priced over $1 million, we actually have seen 100% growth in those types of homes over the last year. So that's just going to push up our year over year home price growth and just looking at that as a pure figure. Now, if we look at something like the Case-Shiller index, what they're analyzing is each individual home. So they're saying this is home A, and what did this sell a few years ago? What is it selling for now? So that's a true home price index. But what we're looking at is the homes that are being sold, and we can see that it's really higher priced homes there's a lot of demand for. The other thing that we're seeing is that 3 and 5 members are saying the market is hotter than normal. Again, this is not a normal year. And so we're really seeing that right now is that people are saying that, yes, absolutely, this is a very hot market, especially for this time of year. When we look at the Massachusetts data, you probably know that a lot of this is reflective of your market. You truly have a housing shortage. For each new 6 jobs that are in the state of Massachusetts, there's only 1 housing permit. So really not having, especially that affordable inventory for buyers out there. Within the state, we actually recently did a report and we ranked the thousands of counties that are out there in the US. And what we wanted to see is that since so many Americans are working remote right now and so many school children are going remote, what are these top counties for actually doing so? So we looked at broadband access, we looked at the number of employees who actually can work from home in those areas. And what we found is that if you look at the state of Massachusetts, where you guys are located in Norfolk, Middlesex, these are actually top work at home counties. So that's, I think, a pretty interesting dynamic as you see that some people may not want to go into Boston proper right now, or their office is just purely closed. So they're not going in. And so what we do see is a lot of people working at home. The other thing that we see here is that there is continued and steady home price growth. Like, again, we're seeing this especially outside of city centers. So we know that city centers are not the most attractive thing to people right now. They are always going to be attractive, but a lot of people are saying, I really want to go to the small town, a rural area to have more breathing room, to be able to just be in a less dense area. And the other thing I think it's always interesting to look at is just the economic activity that's really had from just one home sale within your state. It's actually quite high. It's $128,000. So when people say that housing is just a place for all of the comfort and you want to be a homeowner, it also adds a lot of economic activity. And so that economic activity is things like all of the fixing up that you do once you move in and buying all of the furniture and the rugs and the everything that you end up doing. But then also things like movers and painters and such who do come into the home. It really does add a lot of economic activity. So let me jump into some consumer data I think is really fascinating. So I'm going to tell you on this consumer data, we're actually doing it in waves. And we started at the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm going to be giving you the latest and greatest data, just came out last week, to really show you what consumers are thinking right now. So this consumer data that we have actually shows that people are feeling more comfortable for going to looking at a home that's listed for tours. So just a pure listing presentation. How comfortable do you feel actually doing that? And what we see here is that a sharer is actually recently active. So this is among people who were in the home buying market pre-COVID, now perhaps took a step back or are now recently active in that. We also find that 2/3 overall would either feel comfortable doing that right now or would be ready to go and are recently active in that. I think this is a really strong figure. And the survey that we're doing, it's actually with a number of other industries. So we can actually see things like going to a sporting event or going on a cruise, things that we probably wouldn't really feel comfortable with. And in fact, many of those things are just completely shut down. So you can't even do them. But in comparison to these other types of activities that you would normally be doing, what we see is that actually going to look at a home that's listed right now is very, very high as far as these other activities go. Now, I have to say that seeing these consistently high numbers and rising numbers in recent weeks, I really have to credit the realtors out there who really changed their business practice. And we did these flash surveys at the very beginning of the pandemic back in March. What we found is that members very, very quickly changed their business practices. So the first survey, we were saying, oh, okay, well, maybe people will wear gloves, maybe they'll wear masks. At that time, we didn't actually know that this was an airborne thing. We didn't know that masks would actually be highly recommended. We were probably still bleaching down everything in our house. What we knew though is that members were smarter than that. And they said, you know what, let's make everyone feel safe. Let's wear masks. Let's wear gloves. Let's wear shoe coverings. Let's keep the doors and windows open within the house. Let's have cleanings between listing tours. And because of that, and because of the very quick adoption, there was very, very few members who were not doing those activities. I think that we saw this very fast rebound in real estate because members said, I'm going to make sure that my clients feel safe, either on the buying or the selling side, to make them feel okay doing this transaction. So I really do have to credit the industry for taking those actions very, very quickly. The other thing that we're seeing here is that there's a lot of change in spending. So yes, I am remodeling my home right now, really because we have to. But also we know that there's a lot of Americans who are doing that. You have been staring at the same four walls for 7.5 months now and are probably saying, I have got to make a change. I probably could have ignored that for a while more, but now I've just been staring at this problem and I need to actually fix it. Or just something that's plain ugly. So what we're seeing is that 2/3 have actually remodeled or are thinking about remodeling. That I think it's really interesting. So we asked some follow-up questions here. We didn't expect it to be this high when we started asking these questions, even though what we've seen is that Home Depot, Lowe's, local hardware stores, all of their earnings have been really skyrocketing right now. You know, probably if you're physically going there, it is the most crowded place. And if you're trying to find something online, it is probably back ordered as far as remodeling supplies go. We have seen this activity really rebound, especially if people are staying put. We wanted to understand why. Are you doing this just so that you can like these four walls around you, or are you doing this to sell? I think it's very encouraging to the industry. What we're seeing here is that nearly a third are actually making it more attractive to sell. That really could mean more inventory in the market, which we are very much hurting on, which we very much do not have. So that's an encouraging sign that these people could think about selling. We've asked some follow-up questions on this about the time frame. I'm not super confident in the data. I want to start collecting it a little more to really understand the time frame here. But what we're getting back so far is that they could start considering to sell in 2021. So seeing that movement there could be very encouraging for the market. As we all know, we're short on inventory in so many areas and in so many different price points. The other big thing that's happening right now is that yes, there is a V-shaped recovery when we talk about the housing market. But overall, we've heard the fodder about this K-shaped recovery. Among some Americans are recovering and some are not recovering. And I'll show you some data on those who are really not recovering and really struggling right now too. I think it's important just to keep that in mind as we think about this and this environment. But what we see right now is that wealthy Americans, those who have jobs, those who have been able to save a little money right now, are actually considering purchasing a second home. I think that this is fascinating data. We do not have historical data on this, so I don't know if this is higher or lower. What I do suspect, though, seeing some of the data that's out there, looking at resort markets, looking at ski locations, looking at beachfront properties and beachfront areas, places that are usually seasonally based, that Cape Cod is always popular in the summer, but less so, of course, in the winter as it gets cold and places start closing down. What we've seen actually is that there's a lot of attraction to these types of seasonally based resort type areas. There's a lot of Americans who have cut back their spending on things like vacations, international vacations, entertainment spending, even on clothes, as you only have to worry about a nice blouse and probably can wear your Christmas pajama sweatpants. So what we see is that people are actually chalking this money away also with those incredibly low interest rates and are considering purchasing the second home. I think we're already seeing the data on this. We certainly are on a national level, and it'll be interesting to look at different markets. But this is very encouraging, at least for realtors, to look at this data and say that people who can are certainly going to pick up a second home. The other question that we wanted to ask to consumers out there who are out there right now in the real estate market, this is October data, so very, very recent data, is we wanted to understand, why are you trying to relocate? And especially, why are you trying to move more than 50 miles from your present residence? And so what we found is that, yes, enjoying better weather, certainly top of the list there, but also to lessen the risk of COVID-19. So a lot of people very concerned perhaps of their dense location, but also perhaps even overcrowding within their own home. So if they're trying to even quarantine, socially distance within their own home, perhaps there's different generations living there. That could be quite difficult if you're in a smaller space and perhaps you're accommodating a new individual. The other thing that we see here, and we've seen this consistently, we actually started asking this and adding it to the options here back in the end of June, beginning of July. And if you remember that time period, there's a lot of protests around the country. In fact, there was a lot of protests internationally at that time that really happened after the killing of George Floyd. What we saw is that there's a lot of people who actually said, I need to move from my current location because of social unrest. That is a fascinating reason. It has stayed consistently about 20% of people actually saying that this is the reason why I want to move. I think that this is something to really take into account here and to really kind of dive into. I'm going to show you some slides on this as well, on how these protests really do link towards homeownership, how there's a million reasons why people are protesting right now. Not a million, but there's certainly a lot of them. But I think it's important to really dive into the homeownership data and really take a look at that as well. The other thing that we're seeing here is that there's a lot of fodder right now about almost being at war with your neighbor and not wanting to even share your own political views with your neighbors next door. So just looking at that and how that all feeds in, I do think it's important, especially as we lead up to this election season. We're certainly in it right now. The week that calories don't count and a lot of mindfulness and mental health, I think, is important right now. All right, so let's talk about the protests. And the relationship to housing. The big thing that we see here, and I'm going to show you some data here. It's not fun to look at. It's actually pretty depressing data, is the homeownership rate by race. I'm using the 2019 data, the end of annualized 2019. There is recent data in recent quarters that does show a tick up in the homeownership rate for Black African American households and for Hispanic Latino households. I will caution against that data in the last couple of quarters from the census. And the reason why I do caution against that is the methodology changed drastically. They used to actually physically go to homes and say, basically, are you the owner or are you the renter here? What is the living situation? Unfortunately, with COVID, they can't do that anymore. And so their sample changed how they're collecting data, but then it also changed to a significantly smaller amount of people that they're collecting it from. So I'm very, I would caution against using that because that data is probably not an apples to apples comparison as it has been in the past. Looking at the end of 2019 data, what I'm using here, I'm showing a very small snapshot from 1994 to 2019. And what we see with the homeownership rate is we actually see that the Black African American homeownership rate versus the non-Hispanic white homeownership rate, the gap is significant. It's 73% to just 42%. And that gap is actually as wide as it was when you could actually discriminate based on race in housing. That is the same width of a gap as before the Fair Housing Act. This is an incredibly disturbing fact on its face. There's a lot of reasons why it feeds into this, and the timeline here is significantly longer than going back to 1994. Certainly, this is the data that's available publicly on the website, so this is what I grabbed. I will say here, if you look at this graph, what you can see is that there's actually kind of a push up in the middle of it, and then there's a bounce back down. What we know is that there was a lot of people put into faulty loan products in the boom years, being qualified for subprime loans, for balloon loans, for these no doc loans. Even if they actually qualified for conventional loan products, they were really targeted for these faulty loan products. Unfortunately, what happened during the bust is that African Americans and Hispanic Americans actually lost their homes at double the rate of white Caucasians during the bust years, and unfortunately have not been able to rebuild in that homeownership rate and that lost homeownership that happened during that time period. A lot of this, though, is cyclical. What we know is that for first-time homebuyers, many of them tap their parents, their family members for down payments. Many of them learn about homeownership from their family members. And so it happens to be a generational and a cyclical issue that continues to happen for future generations to really feed into this gap. Now, I'm not going into all of the reasons here that do feed into this. There is a laundry list of them. I am going to show you one other data point here that I think is really important. This is among successful home buyers and how many were actually rejected from their mortgage, even among successful home buyers. And what we see here is that the mortgage denial rate for Black African Americans is actually nearly three times the amount than white Caucasian homebuyers. It's really important, again, to underscore that this is successful homebuyers. These are not those who applied, were rejected from a mortgage application, then just walked away from it and said, oh, well, I don't qualify. I'm not going to try a different lender. I have to say, you have to be pretty savvy to go and try a different lender and say, my debt to income ratio is in check. I have a solid down payment ready to go. I have good earnings. I'm not entirely sure why I'm being rejected. And so these are those people who then went on to find another lender or two other lenders as they continue to be rejected. So I do think this is one of the many reasons, and there's other academic literature on this that does suggest that this is an ongoing problem that does happen during the process. So we talked about at the beginning how we're all just in this pressure cooker. We're all at home nearly 24/7 at this point, certainly spending more time in our home than we ever have before. Our home is really a college dorm. It is the highest end restaurant that you can think of as we all learn how to cook again. And it also is, where we're working, where we're living, and where we're homeschooling. A lot of this though is that's home, and that's a good feeling, but we also know that homeownership is the number one way that Americans really do earn their net worth in America. We are historically really bad savers, and our home is where we build wealth. And what we have seen is that this is the latest and greatest data from the Federal Reserve Board. It was just released a couple weeks ago. What we see here is that the gap actually is widening when we look at net worth by race. And so when we look at this for Black African American non-Hispanics, their net worth is just $24,000 in comparison to white non-Hispanics, where their net worth is more than $188,000. That is a very wide gap, and again, has been widening over time as we do see that white non-Hispanics have earned equity in their home. They have regained jobs from the Great Recession and have come back in. This is 2019 data. This is not collecting COVID information. So again, looking at last year's data on this, but Federal Reserve unfortunately only releases data every 3 years. So we're not going to have really a post-COVID look for a couple of years from now. In saying all of this, that gap is widened. It's one of the many reasons why people are protesting today, looking at how they've been left behind from homeownership, from their net worth. I'm going to show you one more chart on this. And this is very recent data. It's very cool data that the census is actually collecting right now. I do have a little more confidence in this data, in the census pulse data, only because it has only happened during COVID. So there's not an apples comparison of pre-COVID to post-COVID here. It really is a very recent snapshot. So the census is looking at this data on a weekly basis. They release it every Thursday. In all honesty, this is last week's data. I should have this week's data in, but I honestly forgot to put it in here. I'm not sure if it's out yet. We'll say it's not out yet, and I'll feel better about myself. When we look at the data that they are putting out, what we're seeing is they're doing a massive survey of Americans, and they're trying to figure out essentially how financially secure Americans are. When we look at this data, what we see is that about 7% are either not current on their rent or their mortgage payment, or don't have confidence that they'll be able to make their payment at the end of this month. NAR, we're also doing surveys on this. We're really trying to understand our members and the members' effect here, because we actually know that many of them are mom and pop landlords, actually are residential landlords, and may have tenants who are actually not paying rent right now as well with the rent moratorium. So we actually do have data from our own members as well, but then our own members' experience, and if they're able to make their rent and mortgage payment. I will say that it's much more confident for our own members to personally pay their rent and mortgage in comparison to what we're seeing for Americans overall. We also see in this data that 31% are saying that an eviction or a foreclosure is actually likely in the next 2 months for them. They're really not feeling confident that they'll be able to continue making this payment. And much of this has to do with the ability to have the same earnings that they did pre-pandemic to what they do have today. We actually see that nearly a quarter expects someone in their household to either have a loss of employment or income in the next 4 weeks. So really not very secure in their own financial ability to either make household expenses, even to purchase food, but certainly not to make their rent or mortgage payment. No, I say all of this knowing that this is a national snapshot. Census data does actually break this down by race. They also break it down by state. So if you want to get really nerdy and dig into the data, you certainly can. But we also post maps on our website that does dig into this. And we just released one while I was jumping on here, looking at this last week's data as well. So it is very interesting data and something that is worthwhile to dig in. When I looked at the Massachusetts data, it's actually very similar to what we're seeing on the national scale. So there wasn't huge differences here. So I didn't include that map on there. I'm going to shift gears here considerably and talk about demographic changes. This is, I think, a really, really interesting time. When we talk about those job losses, what we're seeing is that a lot of those job losses were actually for young adults as well. And they actually had job losses at higher rates than other Americans did. One of the big things that has happened is that 52% of 19 to 29-year-olds are actually living at home with family. I'm going to leave that there. That is a massive amount of young adults living at home with family. That is the largest share since actually the Great Depression. An incredibly a striking number when we think about the implications for that. But there's a lot of reasons that I suspect feed into that. One, of course, is job losses. The other thing that happened, of course, is that colleges went online, or at least they went hybrid. So some people may actually say, I'm going to stay at home, or I'm going to take a gap year. The other big thing that happened is that a lot of young professionals actually said, I could stay and rent my very expensive apartment, or I could actually move into mom and dad's house with a fully stocked pantry and freezer and quarantine here with my parents. Even if I'm a married couple, we've seen a lot of young adults, young professionals be gainfully employed in doing that as well. So seeing this doubling up with parents has really skyrocketed when we do look at this data. It's been trending up for the last few years. It's been there, but just not at the extreme level that it is now. I'm going to show you some implications of what has been happening pre-COVID and what those implications are. When we look at buyers who purchased last year, what we see is that 1 in 6 Gen Xers and younger boomers actually purchased a multi-generational home. Now, we're going to have latest and greatest data on this in a couple of weeks. It is not out yet, but I will tell you the trend is there. It is following the national trends. We are certainly seeing a lot of families who not only have young adults in their household right now, but they also have aging adult relatives who have moved back in or have moved into their home for their first time. They may have been renting or in a senior center situation, living by themselves, and perhaps their adult children are saying, we need to bring you in. This is a safer situation to actually have you here. The other big thing is that many of these multi-generational homes have kids who are actually under the age of 18 and they may just need help. So it could be essentially who's caring for who here, I'm not sure, but it could be a situation where these families just need a larger home. There are some people who are contributing to these cost savings, actually contributing to the mortgage, to the utilities, to make it a little easier for everyone in that situation to be there. But we certainly are seeing a growth in this, and we have in recent years, and I will certainly tell you that we are going to see an uptick in this moving forward. The other big change that we're seeing here is that birth rates in the US have plummeted. We have more than a 35-year low in birth rates in this country. People are not having children like they used to. It is very expensive to have a child in the US. It is $2,000 per month on average for daycare for a child. Very expensive to add in a child to your household. So whether that's adding a second child or whether that's just having a child at all, we have seen birth rates plummet. What I'm showing you on this chart is home buyers who actually purchased a home with a child under the age of 18. And what we've seen is that looking back at 1985, it was nearly 60% of families had children under the age of 18. And today it's just a little over a third. And I'll tell you, the trend is continuing here as we look at the drop in birth rates and as we see this baby bust situation. Now, there's been a lot of fodder and there's been a lot of jokes, especially early in the pandemic, that we're going to have this huge baby boom as people are home and they have time, that we could see this big baby boom. And 5 years from now, we're going to have a kindergarten class full of little girls named Pandemica. I don't buy it. And I truly don't think it's going to happen, especially when we know that the job losses that have been had are for young adults in this country. It's probably unlikely that they're going to say, this is a great time to add on to my family and have a child. So I'm a little reticent on that data. I think what we're going to continue to see is this baby bust. This does have a lot of implications for housing of where people decide to move, what type of neighborhood they want, what type of school district they want. Do they even care about that remotely? And the size of the house that they actually personally need. The other big change that we are seeing here is that there is a lot of adoption in pets. I just saw this week that there is actually a new industry that has been created and jobs have been created in the pandemic. People who will transport your new baby, fur baby, across the country into your household because you adopted it so remotely from where you live. Because perhaps the shelters around your country or your area have been actually cleared out. We have certainly seen this. People want companionship. They want a pet to entertain their child, to get them away from a screen time. So we have seen pet adoption really skyrocket. I will say this is certainly a lighter topic when we look at this data, but we actually do have a report that we have put out a couple of times called Animal House. We've seen for unmarried couples, for single females, that the neighborhood that they choose and the home features that they choose for their pets, having a fenced yard, being close to a dog park, being close to walking trails are actually more important for single females and for unmarried couples than it is to be close to good schools. This is a big priority for a lot of Americans. And we certainly see unmarried couples and single females ticking up in the numbers. And I'll show you some data on that as well about how they are really a sizable force in the home buying market. So truly, this is a big priority. And these are all the pets who are in this cabin with me right now. We literally have 5 pets because we're insane, 4 cats and a dog. And none of them have joined me, which is amazing. Sometimes they want to throw the webcam on the floor. So we have gotten very lucky so far. When we look at first-time home buying, one of the big things that is happening is that this is truly a reflection in the drop in marriage rates in this country. When we look back at the 1960s, more than 70% of American adults were married. Today, just half of American adults are married. So people are really stepping back from the institution of marriage. That doesn't mean that they're not coupling up, but they're certainly not getting married like they used to. The first-time home buyers who are out there in this country are really mirroring this trend. And looking at this, what we see is that back in 1985, 75% of buyers were married couples. And today it's just a little more than half. So really mirroring that trend in marriage rates that we see in this country. What we did see in this green line right here is we saw an uptick in single female buyers, and it was actually higher than a quarter of first-time home buyers were single females. We've seen a drop off in recent years of single female buyers. I'm not going to give you any hints on the data of where we're looking this next year, but I will tell you that affordability is really playing a key role here. For a single female buyer, a single woman to save her own down payment and be able to get those funds together, it could be quite difficult for her to do that traditionally on a lower income than what you'd have for a single male. In comparison, what we're seeing is that single males have always trended behind single females. They haven't had as large of a share in the market for home buyers. We've always seen single females quite high. The surprising numbers that we're seeing in this last year is that unmarried couples are actually the highest share that we've ever recorded, as well as this other category, this 4%. So we're really seeing that people are pooling incomes together, pooling down payment funds, and purchasing a home together where they may have traditionally done this perhaps on their own if they could afford to get into the market, or perhaps they would have done it as an unmarried couple or as a married couple. When we look at this 4%, this other category, I like to think of it as a roommates category. So perhaps 2 people who had been renting together who decided, let me go purchase a home together. I think we could see a growth in this coming out of COVID and a growth in these unmarried couples if they're deciding, I don't want to actually get married. I don't want that legal institution, but I do actually want to purchase a home with you, especially if I've been renting for a long period of time. So we actually could see a growth in this moving out of COVID, especially if people have been by themselves for a long period of time in their home and say, you know what, let's find a way to buy a home together with these low interest rates and get into this. All right, a big change that we could see moving forward is the help that was given for student loan debt. One of the very, very first stimulus packages that was out there was actually to bring student loan debt to a 0% interest rate, but also to automatically put student loans into forbearance for federal student loans. So you didn't have to make any payments on your federal student loan debt. If you did have that federal student loan debt, that is a big leg up for these individuals who may have lost their jobs. But it also is really helpful if these individuals had other higher loan or higher interest rate debt. Now, the other big thing that happened was the 0% interest rate. This is huge. For 47% of student loan borrowers pre-COVID, they were actually in a negative amortization loan. So a loan where they were making on-time payments, they were a good citizen, they had a good paying job, and they were making these payments. But unfortunately, because of the amount that they were paying on their debt and their interest rate, they actually owed more the next quarter than they did this quarter because of their interest rate. That is a really big problem for student loan debt holders. We know that this is the biggest hurdle for first-time homebuyers to be able to enter the market is paying down their student loan debt, getting their debt to income ratio in check, and being able to save for that down payment. So that's a couple legs up that these borrowers could have. This is a big question mark. I've had a few questions already saying, has this helped? Has this helped? Are we going to see these first-time homebuyers there? I'll say it's a little too soon to tell. These two advantages for student loan debt are still there. And I think they're in place until the end of the year. So borrowers will have a little more time to be able to tackle that debt if they can, especially if they move back home with their family members and they're gainfully employed. This can really be helpful for them. But we're not quite sure yet. We don't have the data to really show the big benefit. So big question mark there. I'm going to shift gears again quite a bit. I'm going to talk about agent use. And I'm going to tell you some data that we're getting back that's from consumers right now in the pandemic too. So when we look at agent use, what we see is it's incredibly high. People want representation as they go through their home buying transaction. They really want someone by their side to tell them about the transaction, to help explain all of the steps, especially in the pandemic, about how to go through this. When we look at agent use right now, what we see is that looking at pre-COVID, 89% of buyers did use an agent in their transaction. I think it's incredibly important to note that yes, first-time home buyers are low. When we look at the historical data, they're only about a third of primary residence buyers right now. But it's important to note that the tenure in home has drastically increased. It used to be that people would move every 6 to 7 years. Now they're moving every 10 years. So they're really holding on to their property for a longer period of time. And because of that, really even your repeat buyer acts like a first-time home buyer in that transaction because they haven't done this in so long. And it's especially a different transaction when you think about all of the concerns that could be there from COVID. The other thing that we see here is that agent use on the selling side is near all-time highs at 89% there as well. So we really are seeing a very high use of agent. FSBO's at historic lows at just 8%. People do not want to sell their home via FSBO. They have huge concerns about how to price their home, how to market their home, and these are the benefits that the agent really brings on the selling side, as well as telling the buyer or the seller how to fix up their home for sale. This is something that's actually moved up in the charts in recent years of what's important to sellers. They've held onto their property for a long period of time. They don't know how to price it. Of course, they want someone to price their home, find a qualified buyer, but also how in the world do I fix up my home that probably hasn't been remodeled in years. And I have been living here, I'm settled in, how do I fix this up? We collected data from agents during COVID. What we found a few months ago is that half of members, half of them, were working with potential sellers who did not have their home listed yet, but actually just needed to know, how do I DIY projects on my home? How do I fix this up so that when I feel comfortable actually listing my home for sale, that I can just flip the switch and get going and actually list my home? That's a very high number. Again, I don't have historical numbers on that because a lot of the questions that we asked during COVID are brand new concerns and brand new questions that we never thought of before. When we look at consumers during the pandemic, what we actually see is that more than half overall are saying that the agent is actually more important now during the pandemic than even before the pandemic. People really understand the value that they can actually have from an agent who will help them bring them through that process, who will help negotiate, who knows the local area, especially as people are moving to different types of areas. And they absolutely are looking at that less density, looking towards that small town and rural area that can provide them more space. The other big thing that we see here, and we did focus groups on this. I don't have hard data on this, but I'll tell you what I heard from these focus groups that I listened in on. There was focus groups on buyers and there were focus groups on sellers. And I will tell you that from the seller perspective, what we saw is that there was a lot of anxiety from these sellers and from potential sellers in the market. People absolutely feel very concerned, not just your typical concern of, am I going to be able to sell my property? Or am I going to be able to find a buyer? Am I going to be stuck with two mortgages if I find a new home? These are the typical concerns that we have seen in the past. The concerns that we're seeing from sellers today are health concerns. So we saw that in one of the first charts, that urgency to sell is absolutely there from sellers, but they're also very, very concerned that they're going to be safe in their transaction. What I heard from one of the people in the focus groups, it was a woman in Florida, and it really stuck with me, is that she was concerned about buyers coming into her home. She didn't know what was going to happen if they did. Was everyone going to wear a mask? Were they going to follow the rules that were set in place by the agent that they had talked about beforehand? And would they actually do the things that were needed? So she stayed in the home during the listing presentations while the buyers came into the home. And she physically went behind the buyer and wiped down everything the buyer touched with bleach wipes because she only felt safe if she was physically doing that, not just the agent, but her herself. I think that that just speaks to the level of anxiety that's out there right now and very, very warranted by a lot of people, especially if there's healthcare concerns. But I have to say that that stuck with me in such a way that if there's any way to have that conversation with the buyers and the sellers that you're working with to say, these are the precautions we're going to take and we're absolutely going to enforce them. We're going to make sure as much as we can to keep you safe in that transaction. I think that that's an incredibly important thing to communicate just to try and assuage those fears. And honestly, on the flip side, it really could increase the inventory that's out there that has really been low in recent years as well. All right, so what's next? I will tell you, I'm not sure. I don't have a crystal ball. I will tell you that I have a lot of question marks on this chart here. We certainly have seen some big trends here. We have seen this really big attraction towards having a larger property, being out of city centers. A lot of this has been past trends. However, when we look at the attraction towards small towns, when we look at buyers last year, a quarter of younger millennials actually did purchase in small towns. Much of that has to do with affordability, the amount of affordability that this younger millennial can purchase in these small towns, but it's really an acceleration and a continuation of these trends. So McMansions having that more space, yes, probably this is going to be a trend moving forward. But I'm also going to throw this one out here. You guys can laugh me off the Zoom, is that people are used to living in tiny condos in city centers in Boston, New York, DC. And as these potential buyers are out there, they may just be saying, I need more land around me. I need more physical space. I want the acreage. I don't necessarily care about the physical property. And they might actually even be willing to purchase these tiny homes on land, put a tiny home on a land, because they are so used to these tiny spaces around them just to have that fresh air. The other thing is that there's a lot of people buying these vacation homes, being attracted to vacation location or vacation spaces. If they have good broadband access, what's holding them back from making that their primary home? It very well could come to that as we see that move forward in the future. They could hold on to their townhouse or condo in the city center, but really make their vacation home their primary residence. The other thing that we suspect that we're seeing in the data right now, we don't have hard numbers on this, is that people could be purchasing early retirement homes. Maybe retirement is 5, 10, 15 years off in the future. You weren't planning on purchasing that retirement property right now, but interest rates are so low. What would be holding them back from doing that right now? We absolutely could be seeing that. The other big thing is that if these things happen, as people continue to look towards these more rural, traditionally recreation areas, small towns, what's going to happen to those areas? We've already seen many millennials really reinvent the suburbs, really make it work for them. But what happens to these areas? Do they reinvent them? Do they have a demand for commercial properties that weren't traditionally there? What happens to that? And then the big question mark for so many Americans right now is, how do schools come into play? More than 70% of school children went online for their first day of school. I know many schools have come back into a physical location, and then some have gone back remote. So I think this is a huge question mark for families as they try and tackle this. And then also this drop in tenure. I talked about some of that, how we have seen this 10-year rise to all-time highs. We're seeing it at 10 years. People traditionally moved every 6 to 7 years. And the big reason why is that something in your life happened. You had a baby, you had a new job, or you had a marriage or divorce. People are staying in their workplaces longer. They had pre-COVID, probably now as well as they're staying put. But we certainly have seen the birth rates drop. We've seen the marriage rates drop. So those types of personal things that are happening in our life, those impetus would have fallen as well. I think we can all agree that COVID is certainly one of those things that happened to all of us right now worldwide, and we're all dealing with it. And I think this could really change that tenure as people move and just say, I need to urgently move. I need to make this work for me right now. I'll figure it out later. When we look at the economic forecast, I will say that these come out on a frequent basis. This is last month's forecast. We are not releasing one this month, but we will release one, I believe, next month as well. We do expect that existing home sales will continue to increase. We are seeing the demand there. There would actually be more home sales if we did have more inventory, and big hurdle right now for buyers to just find that right property. And then home prices, we expect them to continue increasing as we don't have that inventory in the market. We expect that mortgage rates will continue to stay low. The Federal Reserve has said that they're not even thinking about changing them, so certainly going to stay put. And then the unemployment rate, likely going to see that continue ticking down as jobs are regained in the economy. As far as GDP is concerned, yes, the new numbers were out today. Yes, we saw a recovery from the second quarter's numbers where we did see that big plummet. But on an annualized basis, when we look at year end, we are looking at a year end where we are down in GDP. So that is the current forecast that we have. I'm not sure if Lawrence Yun, our chief economist, will update that based on today's numbers. But as far as the last month's forecast, this is where we stand. For 2021, we do expect that all economic activity for GDP will increase next year, but we're not quite there yet. This was a lot of national data. I did pull what I could and what I know about Massachusetts in your local area. I know that every area is unique though, and you very well know your area much better than I do. We do have a website that is brand new that is devoted to state and local statistics. So please do check us out. It is all interactive. So you can click on these drop-down menus for state level data or for MSA level data, and you can play around with these cool interactive maps, and we're updating them as frequently as we can there as well. And then lastly, I am one of the researchers in the department, but please do check us out. Check out our website and our social media, our blog. We have new information on a daily basis, tracking all of the changes in the economy related to COVID on our blog, and then cross-posting them on all the social media. So you can just passively follow us there if you'd like to. And I'll say lastly, a lot of the data that we had is from our Profile home buyers and sellers. It is an awesome report, and not just because I love working on it. And as soon as I'm off this, I'm going to go back to working on this year's report, but it's going to be free this year under Right Tools right now. You can actually download the report first day it's released for free. So please do check out that report in a couple weeks from now, and you can grab that great resource. So thank you guys so much. And I see that there's 17 comments, so I am scared to check on that chat box and start answering questions. We will see what you guys have for me.
We actually have some questions in the Q&A as well, so I'm not sure they were so much in there, but we had a question from one of our directors, Nellie Soto. She said, thank you for the presentation. And would you say some sort of reform is needed in Massachusetts as far as zoning in our state to allow more inventory to be built? As even in our suburbs, even though we have land available, the red tape and loops builders have to jump, and money that they have to spend shies them away from building. As you look at national data, do you know where we stand as far as building new inventory compared to other states in the Northeast?
Yeah, so that six new jobs to one new home, that gives me some indication that there's definitely some hurdles for builders there. And that is on the far end of the spectrum of the intensity of new jobs to homes built. I will say that there is absolutely across the country a lot of restrictions on building homes, and it varies dramatically from area to area, whether that is Buffalo, New York, and you have properties, but they absolutely need some rehab, to LA, where you have density restrictions. And so you don't have really even second story or three-story buildings. I don't know the restrictions in your local area as well as you guys do. You guys can probably all have a conversation among a few of you, and you know that certainly better than I do. But I will say that builders have, in recent months, been ramping up their building. But absolutely, they cite the problems with lumber costs, especially softwood lumber. I think it's gone up like 80% since April. Even talking about rebuilding my own bathroom, the contractor was like, "You don't understand, lumber costs. This is going to cost you so much more, but your floor is rotted through." And I was like, "Okay, well, we have to do that because I can't like fall to the basement." So certainly, lumber costs are one of them. Labor. That's a huge restriction. And then impact fees. There's been a lot of talk, especially as state and local governments have lost money with this recession, with COVID-19, that they're actually going to increase impact fees, which were already astronomical. And then density restrictions, a huge problem as well, and just having the available land. So each area has its own problems really building, but it really is a nationwide problem overall.
We had another question. African American denial of loan, would you say it is done by underwriters, et cetera, when the name is seen, et cetera?
That is a fantastic question. And I don't have an answer to that, unfortunately, of where in the process that happens. I know the academic literature that's out there does match the data that we're getting back, even from successful home buyers. It is an unfortunate situation. I think, we all can do as much as we can to really close that gap. And whether that's, just being cognizant of the data that's out there too, and just being aware of it. I think that's honestly half the battle there.
And I know NAR has been doing a phenomenal job with focusing on the issues of fair housing, and our state association. I know we have our state association president, Kurt Thompson, on here as well. And Nellie, who asked the initial question, had chaired a committee for our state, or task force for our state association, and they created some really great programs on implicit bias and rental issues and things of that sort. So I know we're working on it, but I know that you had mentioned that huge net worth gap, and how can we as realtors and associations work to close that gap a little?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of resources that are on the NAR website. And as far as action items go, I'm probably not the best person. I'm really the data person. But I know that there are free resources on our website to please do check them out. And there's the great designation or certification. I actually don't know which one it was either, the At Home with Diversity as well. So I think in that, they'll probably give you some good tools to help close that gap, much more than I can, as they're the professional educators on that. Thank you.
And do you have some questions, Kristen?
No, I mean, this was just fascinating. This data the statistics are crazy. And I think it's really going to be beneficial to anybody who was actually participating today and watching your presentation, because these are some great numbers that we can bring back to our offices and educate people with. So.
I have a few more to throw at you, Jessica, if you have time.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
So you talked about the lumber costs, and we have seen that skyrocket. What is the short-term and long-term impact that we're going to see on housing with supply chain issues and the cost that's going to have on real estate?
Yeah, so definitely for those new homes, we've seen that restricted building. We've seen that really be such a huge hurdle, even as far back as looking back to the Great Recession. So 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago at this point, we've really seen that home builders haven't been out there as much as really we need them to be, especially at that affordable price point for buyers, for those entry-level buyers. And so that's the huge problem, is that yes, builders are getting back into the space now. We've seen them get back into the space sporadically and start ramping up building over the last few years. That being said, they're at the really high price point. That is not the price point for first-time home buyers. And we've seen first-time home buyers really held out of the market, being priced out of the market, all cash buyers coming in. and the bidding wars that have been there too for those few affordable existing properties that come on. So I think that's going to be the really hard part, and the long-term consequence. And I think we're seeing it already as those 52% of young adults are living at home. That's an eye-shocking number. And there's some really big implications there for not just those young adults who actually probably are going to be okay. They'll be able to save their money, pay down their debt. But the other big implication that we're seeing is that for that parental figure, that family member who may want to downsize, that's just kind of gone out the window. They're not downsizing. That could affect their retirement in the future too, and their own savings. So definitely two sides of the coin there.
Okay, I have another question. What are your predictions for post-election?
Oh God, I think my internet went out. I don't know.
On real estate and housing.
Okay. I think I will say, as far as housing goes, some years, and when we look at an election year, you see people retract in their activity, their real estate activity, starting in September. We certainly have not seen that this year. People are there. They're there as a force in the market. So I will say that that's very encouraging when we look at that data. People are going to purchase a home long term. So they're not thinking about a transaction that's happening in an election year. We've already seen, of course, that people want to move to a less dense area, that we're seeing that they want to move where their political views are closely aligned with theirs. So we're seeing that kind of separation, but you are seeing that activity is there. I'll say I believe that Biden has a proposal for down payment help of $15,000 for first-time home buyers. I don't know if all of that is fleshed out, but I will say just on the $15,000, that's a huge benefit for first-time home buyers. But we've seen home prices ramp up in such a degree that that could just be a portion of, unfortunately, what down payment they would need.
Yeah. I was glad you mentioned your Twitter account for NAR Research. I promote that at every new member orientation because it gives data in such small digestible pieces for those of us that aren't economists, like wizards like you and Dr. UNR. So it's a great information source. So any of you who aren't following NAR Research and Jessica on Twitter, you should, and download the Home Buyer and Seller Report, which is phenomenal. I made sure I downloaded the 2019 one with the Right Tools Right Now program, and I'm happy to hear that the next one's going to be available for us to download for free too. And I know you have a lot of reports going on. Is there one that you have done most recently that is your favorite, or one that's coming out that you're really excited about?
Well, I mean, the profile of home buyers and sellers is kind of what we've been immersed in the last month or so, really dissecting all that data, and we're really putting the finishing touches right now. I'll give you guys a sneak peek for the new one that we're doing. We're actually going to have 2 new chapters. It's going to be buyers who actually closed on their transaction during COVID, and sellers who closed on their transaction during COVID. So there's some really unique data that we're really hoping to be first to the table with on that too. So that's my favorite right now. But we're digging into everything that we're getting back, and data is changing rapidly. The other big resource I'll tell you about completely free as well. Thursday mornings, we release a weekly housing market monitor, and all of this national data that's out there is all synthesized. It's put into a very short format. It has cool graphics in it. And every Thursday morning we post that as well. So while we were chatting, it was actually just posted. So please do check that one out.
Great, awesome. Those are all my questions. We did have one more that came from the floor. Do we have a liaison at NAR for the Home Builder Association or Independent Home Builder Association?
Yeah, so NAHB is great. So the National Association of Home Builders. So on an economics level, I actually meet in a monthly group, and so we do talk to them on a frequent basis. And Rob Dietz is their chief economist. I'll tell you another little secret too. Rob Dietz and I live in the same townhouse community outside of DC, so we are in frequent communication, especially about all the crazy things that happen in our houses. But yes, we closely work with them. And then on a professional side too, we have sustainability contacts who actually frequently talk to each other as well. So yes.
So that relationship is there. Maybe we can work on that better in our state and local associations as well. I think I'm out of questions for you.
All right. Well, thank you guys all so much. I know everyone's incredibly busy right now, so just please keep doing the good work that you are. keeping buyers and sellers there. So
And thank you for joining us. We're so happy you took the time, even not being at home, to join us and share all of the amazing data that you have, and putting it into a way that is so easy for us to apply and understand. And the data is changing, and it's so interesting.
Yes. Thank you.
I'm going to hand this back over to Kristen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.